They had been told that American soldiers were demons, monsters who would torture and kill them without mercy. But when 247 Japanese women stepped off the transport ship in San Francisco Bay on September 12, 1945, they found no cruelty, no hatred. Instead, they were met with something far more dangerous to their beliefs: kindness, warmth, and humanity that shattered everything they had been taught. No whips, no screams, only kindness, chocolate, and smiles that made no sense. 247 Japanese women who had braced themselves for death instead found hot showers, clean beds, and soldiers holding doors for them. By the third day, quiet whispers began spreading through the barracks. "We've never seen men like this." What happened next would destroy everything they believed about enemies, about honor, and about themselves. They had been told that Americans were monsters, yet what awaited them revealed the opposite, that humanity could survive even amid war. As the September fog blanketed San Francisco Bay, 247 Japanese women stood trembling on the deck, unaware that beyond the mist lay not punishment but kindness, powerful enough to unravel everything they thought they knew. The transport ship moved slowly through the gray water, its engines groaning like something worn and weary. On deck, 247 Japanese women stood huddled together, hands gripping the rails, eyes wide with fear. Most of them were young, between 18 and 30 years old, faces hollowed by war hearts, filled with dread as they approached the enemy's shore for the first time. They had once served as nurses, radio operators, translators, and clerks for the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific. Now their torn uniforms, matted hair, and hollow faces told the story of weeks of hunger and despair at sea. Some clutched small bags holding everything they still owned. Others had nothing left at all. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and diesel, a scent heavy with the weight of defeat and uncertainty. Seagulls cried overhead as the ship glided slowly into San Francisco Bay. Through the thick fog, the Golden Gate Bridge emerged, its red towers rising like an impossible dream. 247 Japanese women prisoners stood in silence, eyes wide with awe. Back home, bridges were nothing but ruins of war. Yet here stood one that touched the sky, untouched, radiant, and impossibly whole. In that moment, they began to sense that the world beyond their propaganda was not broken, but breathtakingly alive. As the transport ship pierced the thick fog of San Francisco Bay Co., a 22-year-old nurse from Osaka whispered tremblingly, "They will kill us when we land." Beside her, Yuki, a radio operator who had served in the Philippines, stayed silent, her jaw clenched tight. She had seen what happened to prisoners, and the memories still haunted her. In that fragile silence between fear and arrival, the two women faced not only the prospect of death, but the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. The propaganda officers repeated the warning again and again: Americans are savages. They will torture Japanese women and strip them of their dignity. Death would be a mercy compared to what awaits. The ship's horn wailed 3 times deep and mournful, echoing through the fog. The women flinched at the sound. Some began to cry softly. Fear was no longer a rumor, it had become a living thing closing in around them. The Japanese women stood frozen on the deck, some whispering prayers to their ancestors for strength, others paralyzed by fear, their minds blank. As the ship slowly docked at the military pier, they saw their first glimpse of the enemy American soldiers, standing in loose groups, smoking and chatting casually. No shouting, no cruelty, no menace. In that quiet, surreal moment, their terror began to falter, replaced by a strange confusion, because the monsters they had been taught to fear looked far too human. The Japanese women pressed close to the railings, staring down at the men they had been taught to fear. But something was wrong. The American soldiers weren't shouting, weren't snarling, and weren't even pointing their rifles at the ship. They simply stood waiting, some laughing at a comrade's joke. In that moment, fear began to crumble, and for the first time, the image of the demonic enemy started to look human. A single American soldier raised his hand in a casual wave, a gesture so simple it froze Ko in disbelief. "Did you see that?" he waved. Yuki whispered back, "Maybe it's a trick to make us lower our guard." But as the gangway clanged down and the American officers appeared with clipboards in hand, calling out orders in English, they couldn't understand. Fear gave way to confusion. The men below weren't shouting or threatening, they just waited calm and composed. That single wave marked the beginning of something far more unsettling than hostility. The realization that the enemy could smile. A Japanese-American soldier stepped forward, his voice calm yet firm as he spoke in their native language. "You will exit the ship in single file. You will receive medical checks and be assigned quarters. No harm will come to you. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention." For the first time, fear faltered. The women looked at one another, confused, uncertain. Could an enemy truly sound compassionate? The words echoed, not like an order, but like a promise breaking through the terror they had carried across the sea. In that moment, the idea of what enemy meant quietly began to change. When the translator mentioned the Geneva Convention, the group of Japanese women froze. Ko had never heard those words before, and Yuki only knew them from faint, unspoken rumors. Slowly and reluctantly, they began descending the gangway, each step feeling like a walk toward execution. The wood creaked beneath their feet as fog swirled around them, thick and cold. It was the moment they stepped away from everything they once believed, into a world where the enemy followed rules, order, and a strange mercy they could not yet comprehend. When Ko's foot touched American soil for the first time, she didn't feel the horror she had expected. The American soldiers waiting below weren't shouting or sneering, they simply watched with curiosity and gentle expressions. One of them smiled at her, not cruelly, not mockingly, just smiled. And that small human gesture confused her more than any threat ever could. In that fleeting moment, the fear and propaganda within her began to crumble, because sometimes true power lies not in cruelty, but in kindness. When the Japanese women prisoners stepped into the white building, filled with the scent of disinfectant and unfamiliar flowers, they realized the most terrifying thing wasn't a weapon, it was kindness. Standing before them were not rough soldiers, but calm, professional American nurses. In that moment, their beliefs began to collapse. The enemy they had been taught to hate was treating them with dignity and compassion instead of cruelty. The translator instructed them to remove their uniforms and place them in the provided bags, promising clean clothes after medical examination and showers. Panic rippled through the group. For these women, it meant humiliation. Ko's face burned with shame. In Japan, modesty meant everything. Yet that moment of fear and embarrassment marked the beginning of something unexpected. The realization that their supposed enemies were treating them not with cruelty, but with respect. Being forced to undress before strangers, it was a humiliation worse than death for the captured Japanese women. Trembling, they turned away, trying to preserve a shred of dignity in a situation without choice. Yet, in that moment of shame, something unexpected happened. The American nurses moved among them with quiet compassion, no laughter, no judgment. They didn't just examine bodies, they restored dignity. In that tiled room, under the warm light and soft voices, the women realized for the first time in years that kindness could hurt not because it wounded, but because it healed. The American nurses simply handed each Japanese prisoner a white towel and gently motioned toward the next room. The medical examination was quick but thorough. They checked for wounds, infections, and disease writing, careful notes. Amid the fear of women who expected cruelty, the nurses spoke softly to one another, occasionally offering reassuring smiles, small gestures that quietly began to dismantle everything the prisoners had been taught about the monstrous enemy. An American nurse noticed Ko's trembling hands, gently placed her hand on the young woman's shoulder, and softly said, "It's okay." Ko didn't understand the words, but she understood the kindness in the nurse's eyes, a compassion that needed no translation. She broke down in tears, not from fear, but from the shock of being treated like a human being. Moments later, the women were led into a large, tiled shower room filled with warm, thick steam, the first true warmth Ko had felt in years. The translator explained that they should wash thoroughly, that soap would be provided, and that they could take as much time as they needed. Soap, real soap. The women stood frozen, staring at the white bars beneath the shower heads, lifting them slowly as if touching something rare and fragile. For them, that small object was more than a tool for cleansing. It was a symbol of humanity, the first moment after years of war that allowed them to feel their own worth again. The soap was smooth, heavy, and smelled of lilacs, a scent from a world untouched by war. Yuki turned on the faucet and gasped as hot water cascaded over her. Real hot water, not lukewarm or cold. She hadn't felt it in over a year. In the field hospitals where she had worked, they were lucky to have any water at all. In that moment, the warmth and fragrance didn't just cleanse her skin, they began to wash away the fear, revealing a truth more powerful than any weapon, that compassion can disarm more deeply than cruelty ever could. Steam filled the air as hot water poured over them, washing away more than dirt. Around Ko, the Japanese women cried as they washed, laughter and sobs blending into one fragile symphony of release. Some simply stood still, letting the warmth flow across their faces, their hair, their bodies, as if cleansing months of fear and exhaustion. Ko scrubbed her skin until it turned pink, as though she could erase not just the grime of war, but the pain that came with it. It wasn't merely a shower, it was a quiet rebirth. A moment where the enemy's mercy felt like sunlight breaking through years of darkness. The young woman washed her hair 3 times, her fingers working through tangles that had felt permanent. Thick white soap lathered across her skin, and the floral scent surrounded her like a dream. In that warm steam, she remembered her mother's garden in Osaka, the cherry blossoms in April before the war began. When they finally stepped out, they were given clean undergarments, simple gray dresses, and soft cotton socks. For the first time since the war, they felt human again. The dresses were plain but clean, fitting surprisingly well. Many women froze before the mirrors, barely recognizing themselves after months of filth and fear. The oldest Tomoko touched her reflection and whispered, "I forgot. I could look like this." That moment wasn't just about cleanliness, it was the quiet rebirth of dignity. For the first time since the war began, they saw themselves not as prisoners, not as defeated enemies, but as human beings restored whole and alive again. Beneath the calm relief and fleeting comfort, a quiet storm began to rise, confusion and shame. They had expected pain, punishment, and suffering, yet instead, the enemy gave them soap, hot water, and clean clothes. That kindness unsettled them more than cruelty ever could, forcing them to question everything they had believed about war, honor, and themselves. What kind of enemy does this to their prisoners? The question echoed in their minds as they were led into a mess hall large enough to hold 300 people. Long tables were covered with spotless white cloths, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread, roasting meat, brewing coffee, and melting butter. The fragrance was so rich, so comforting, that many women froze at the doorway. Invited to take their seats, they sat in silence, unable to comprehend why the enemy was treating them with such humanity. Lunch will be served. The Japanese women prisoners walked quietly into the mess hall, backs straight, hands folded in their laps, eyes wide with fear. None of it felt real. It had to be a trick. The food might be poisoned. Perhaps this was their last meal before torture began. Yet as the smell of fresh bread, roasted meat, and coffee filled the air, their fear mixed with confusion. Why would the enemy feed them like humans, not captives? American soldiers in crisp white kitchen uniforms appeared carrying large trays of steaming food. They moved quietly along the rows, placing plates before each Japanese woman. Golden roast chicken, mashed potatoes with rich brown gravy, green beans, soft white bread with a pat of butter, a glass of cold milk, and a cup of hot coffee. Ko stared at her plate, her breath catching in disbelief. She hadn't seen this much food in 3 years. That meal was more than nourishment, it was a revelation, a quiet act of kindness that began to shatter everything she believed about her enemies. Before the Japanese women prisoners, the table overflowed with food they hadn't seen in 3 years: golden roast chicken, mashed potatoes, white bread, and a glass of cold milk. No one dared to move, their eyes fixed on the plates, as if the food might vanish if they blinked. The translator said softly, "Please eat, it's for you." Still, silence filled the hall. Finally, Yuki lifted her fork, a small gesture that marked the beginning of something profound, the moment when fear of the enemy began to crumble under the weight of unexpected kindness. Yuki's hands trembled as she cut a small piece of chicken and lifted it to her lips. The flavor burst across her tongue, rich, savory, unmistakably real. She closed her eyes and began to cry. Then the dam broke. Around her, women began to eat, some slowly, some frantically, as if the food might vanish any second. Tears mixed with the taste of chicken potatoes, and something even rarer, the kindness of their enemies. Tears streamed down their faces as they ate. Some laughed between bites, a sound desperate yet full of fragile joy, while others sat in silence, eyes fixed on their plates, unable to process what was happening. Ko bit into the bread, and the soft texture made her gasp. For the last year of the war, she had eaten bread made from sawdust and tree bark. Now this simple loaf, warm and real, reminded her of what survival and humanity truly meant amid the ruins of war. The bread was soft, white, perfect. She spread butter on it with trembling fingers and took another bite. The richness made her dizzy. Across the table, Tomoko was crying so hard she couldn't eat, clutching a piece of chicken in her hand, her whole body shaking with sobs. "My children," she whispered, and silence fell over the room. Beneath the warmth of that generous meal lay unbearable guilt. They were being fed by their enemies with kindness, while their own children starved among the ruins of Japan. "My children are starving in Tokyo, and I'm eating chicken." The words struck the women like a thunderclap. Surrounded by roast chicken and mashed potatoes, they suddenly felt the unbearable truth that while they were fed and sheltered by the enemy, their families back home were starving amid ruins. The meal became more than food. It was a mirror of guilt and sorrow, proof that compassion could come from those they had been taught to hate. It wasn't the enemy's cruelty that broke them, but their mercy, a mercy that exposed the emptiness of everything they once believed. The enemy fed them better than their own country ever had. Some women pushed their plates away, unable to continue out of shame and guilt. Others devoured every bite, driven by a hunger deeper than pride. A few ate and cried at once, tears falling into their mashed potatoes, torn between relief and anguish. In that moment, they realized the painful truth: the enemy was sustaining them with a humanity their homeland had never shown. The American soldiers stood quietly along the edges of the dining hall, their faces unreadable. Some shifted uneasily, unsure how to react, as the Japanese women prisoners wept while eating. A young soldier whispered, "They're crying. Should we do something?" The older one replied softly, "Just let them eat. They'll be okay." But Ko wasn't sure anymore. Everything she'd believed about the enemy was falling apart. Cruelty was expected, but kindness was far more disarming. The enemy was supposed to hate them, yet what the Japanese women felt wasn't hatred, it was kindness, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. After the meal, they were led to their barracks, walking in a daze, their stomachs full for the first time in months, their minds spinning with confusion. They couldn't comprehend how their enemy could treat them with compassion instead of vengeance. The barracks were simple wooden buildings, painted white with small windows and neat rows of beds. No more straw mats or dirt floors, but real beds with metal frames, mattresses, pillows, and neatly folded blankets. At the foot of each bed stood a small wooden trunk where each prisoner could keep her personal belongings. The translator explained that they were allowed to write letters home with paper and pencils provided. For women who had braced themselves for punishment, the sight of warm blankets, clean beds, and the right to write home was overwhelming. A different world had opened, one where the enemy treated them with respect instead of retribution. Ko chose the bed by the window and sat down slowly. The mattress was soft, not luxurious, but tender in a way she had forgotten existed. She pressed her hand into it, feeling it give under her weight and spring back. She hadn't slept on a mattress since leaving Japan 2 years earlier. Beside her, Yuki ran her hand over the wool blanket, her eyes distant. "It's thick," she murmured. In that quiet moment, both women felt the strange ache of being cared for by their enemies, a paradox more disarming than any weapon. In the winter chill of California, the Japanese women prisoners could hardly believe their eyes. They had been given thick, warm blankets. Inside the white-painted barracks, they tested the bed's opened trunks and touched the fabric in disbelief. At the far end of the room sat a small wood stove, still cold. As the translator explained, it would be lit each evening to keep them warm. For women who had expected cruelty, this simple gesture of comfort felt almost impossible, a kindness so gentle it unsettled them. Tomoko sat on her bed, burying her face in her hands, whispering that everything about this felt wrong. As prisoners, they were supposed to suffer to pay for their nation's sins. But when she looked around the barracks, the tidy beds, warm blankets, windows with curtains, she realized the enemy was treating them like human beings, not captives. In that moment, her belief in honor, suffering, and enemy cruelty collapsed, replaced by something far more unsettling: compassion. That night, as darkness settled and the lights dimmed, the Japanese women lay in their beds, wrapped in warm blankets, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American military base. Trucks rumbled in the distance, soldiers called to one another in a language they didn't understand, and the steady hum of generators filled the air. Outside, crickets chirped, and somewhere a radio played soft, jazzy music, foreign yet strangely comforting. In that moment, they realized that the war was over, but the world they had entered was entirely new. Ko pulled the blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. Her body was warm, her stomach full, her skin clean. She was safe. Yet she had never felt more confused in her life. The propaganda films she had seen in Japan had painted Americans as monsters without souls, without honor, without mercy. But lying in that warm bed, everything she had believed began to crumble. She realized that the enemy she had feared for so long was nothing like what she had been taught. She once believed that surrender meant torture and death, that the enemy was a heartless monster. But when she recalled the soldier's smile on the dock, the nurse's gentle hand on her shoulder, the warm chicken on her plate, and the soap scented with flowers in her grasp, everything she had believed unraveled. Not through cruelty, but through kindness, a force far more powerful than fear itself. Everything she once believed was a lie, and realizing that truth was more terrifying than any battle she had ever faced. After the shock faded, life inside the camp took on a surreal rhythm of ordinary routine. Every morning at 6:30, a bell rang softly across the compound. The women rose, put on their simple gray dresses, and made their beds with precise military discipline, a habit none of them could abandon even in captivity. Within that strange normalcy, they began to realize that the enemy they had feared as monsters were in fact people capable of respect and humanity. Breakfast was served at 7 o'clock sharp, always abundant and warm, like a small miracle oatmeal, with brown sugar and raisins, soft scrambled eggs, toast with jam, fresh fruits like apples, oranges, sometimes even bananas with coffee, milk. Every morning, this generosity appeared on their tables as if by magic, leaving the Japanese women prisoners stunned. After breakfast, they were assigned gentle duties, laundry, kitchen, or hospital support. What puzzled them most wasn't the work, but the steady kindness that came with it, something they had never known before. The labor the Japanese women POWs expected to be brutal turned out to be humane and manageable. Some were assigned to the camp laundry, operating massive mechanical washers that did most of the work. Others helped in the kitchens, assisting American cooks with meal preparation. This unexpected kindness began to erode the propaganda they had believed, revealing an enemy that valued discipline, respect, and humanity, qualities far removed from the monsters they had been taught to fear. A few women with English skills were assigned to translate documents or teach basic Japanese phrases to curious American soldiers. Ko was placed in the camp hospital, assisting nurses with folding bandages, organizing supplies, and cleaning equipment. The work was light, almost gentle. For the first time since the war began, she felt useful without pain, and the quiet rhythm of healing began to replace the chaos of destruction. Inside the POW camp, she wasn't treated as an enemy but as a colleague. Working alongside two American nurses, Helen and Margaret, she learned how to use medical instruments, practiced English words for supplies, and sometimes shared their lunches. But the most astonishing part came later. They were paid. Every Friday, each woman received a small amount of camp, scrip paper currency, valid only inside the camp, yet real enough to buy something. In a world still recovering from war, being allowed to work, to be respected, and to earn through trust instead of fear, began to unravel everything she had once believed about enemies and humanity. With their small wages, the Japanese women prisoners could visit the camp canteen, a modest shop stocked with items that felt impossible. Chocolate bars, Hershey's, Nestle, Baby Ruth, neatly lined up on the shelves, made them stare in awe like children before a shrine. In Japan, chocolate had vanished for years, reserved only for the military elite. And now, the enemy, those once described as monsters, offered them the sweet taste of humanity, revealing that the world was far kinder and wider than they had ever been taught to believe. Inside the POW camp, the Japanese women were astonished to find they could use their labor wages to buy luxuries, cigarettes, lipstick, perfume, notebooks, embroidered handkerchiefs. These were not for survival but for feeling human again. On her first visit to the canteen, Yuki carefully bought a chocolate bar. As the sweetness melted on her tongue, she realized that the enemy had given her something her own country never did, the sense of being treated as truly human. Yuki carried the chocolate bar back to the barracks like a treasure, unwrapping it carefully, breaking off one square at a time. The sweetness melted on her tongue, and she closed her eyes, savoring it. "I'm eating chocolate," she whispered to Ko. "We're prisoners of war, and I'm eating chocolate." Life in the camp settled into rhythm, hot lunches, hearty dinners with meat almost every night. What began as disbelief slowly turned into awakening that even in captivity they were treated with a kindness their own homeland had never shown them. Between work shifts, the Japanese women prisoners were allowed to rest, read, and experience rare moments of peace. The Americans had built a small library within the camp, filled with Japanese books they had somehow gathered. The women could borrow these books, read during their free hours, and discuss stories together as if the war had never existed. Every Sunday was a full day of rest, a small taste of freedom within captivity. In that quiet space, the first smiles since the war slowly returned, and they began to realize that humanity could survive, even in the ruins of hatred. Inside the American prison camp, the Japanese women were allowed to rest, write letters home, or attend religious services if they wished. A Buddhist chaplain visited once a month, and Christian services were held every week. The Americans imposed no belief, they accommodated both. This gentle, humane, almost domestic routine slowly eroded the prisoners' resistance more effectively than any torture ever could. Their bodies grew stronger, color returned to their cheeks, their frames filled out after months of starvation. Yet with each meal came a deeper torment. Every bite of warm food reminded them that their families back home were starving. Inside the quiet camp, far from the ruins of Japan, these women faced a battle more haunting than any fought with weapons, the battle between survival and guilt. Every bar of chocolate felt like betrayal, a sweet symbol of guilt toward those starving back home. Yet they couldn't stop accepting the food, the warmth, the quiet kindness. No barbed wire held them captive. It was compassion itself that bound them. The paradox was unbearable, the realization that perhaps their enemies treated them with more humanity than their own nation ever had. Some women clung desperately to their old beliefs, convinced that the Americans' kindness was merely a trick to extract cooperation. Yet others began to question everything they had ever been taught. The war was over, Japan had lost, and in that loss they discovered something that shook them to their core, that the enemy they had been taught to fear was capable of compassion. The enemy was not what they had been told. The enemy was human, more complex, more frightening, and more real than they had imagined. When letters from home finally arrived, fragile and delayed, each trembling line from Japan carried more than news, it carried guilt. Those thin envelopes became windows to a broken homeland, a reminder that while they were warm and fed, their families were starving amid ruins. The ink itself seemed to whisper, "You survived, but at what cost?" In late October, Ko received her first letter from her mother, a sheet so thin it was nearly transparent. The once graceful handwriting now trembled, broken by hunger and despair. Each line cut like a knife to the heart, their home destroyed, her father ill, her little brother starving. Ko held the letter with shaking hands, realizing that while she ate well and slept safely in captivity, her loved ones back home were slowly dying. The guilt weighed heavier than any chain, a torment born not of cruelty but of the kindness shown by her enemies. The letter from Tokyo cut through Ko's heart like a blade. You are alive, and for that we are thankful. But Tokyo is gone. Her parents now live beneath sheets of rusted metal, surviving on a single meal a day if luck allows. Today they had only rice water and a few leaves of cabbage. Her little brother grows thinner with each passing week. Those trembling lines made Ko realize that while she was fed and safe in captivity, her homeland was starving and broken beyond repair. The letter from Ko's aging mother in Tokyo read more like a prayer than a message. She wrote that they survived on thin rice water and a few cabbage leaves, that Ko's little brother still asked about her every day, remembering the sweets she once brought home before the war. There were no sweets now, hardly anything at all, but they were alive, and for her that was enough. The mother hoped Ko was being treated fairly, that she wasn't suffering too much. Ko read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling more with each reading. In those fragile, uneven lines, she felt the weight of love, pain, and guilt, the unbearable truth that while she was safe and fed, her family was starving amid the ashes of Tokyo. That night, Ko couldn't bring herself to eat dinner. She stared at the roast beef and carrots on her plate, but only saw her little brother's thin face in her mind. Carefully folding her mother's letter, she placed it in her small trunk and left the dining hall quietly. Around her, other women clutched similar letters, each one describing starvation, homelessness, and despair. Inside the warm barracks filled with food and safety, they all came to the same heartbreaking realization: their survival here was built on the suffering of their families across the ocean. Inside the quiet POW camp in California, letters from Japan arrived like knives to the heart. One woman learned her husband had died of starvation. Another discovered her parents were killed in a firebombing. A third found out her children were sent to live in the countryside because there was no food left in the cities. Beyond the camp's fences, America thrived in abundance, while inside guilt grew heavy as they realized their enemy lived in comfort while their homeland lay in ruins. Beyond the camp's fences, American towns bustled with life. Stores stood open and full of goods, children played in parks, and families drove cars down spotless streets lined with houses untouched by war. When taken outside for work details, the Japanese women quietly watched a different world, one where life went on peaceful and whole as if the war had happened on another planet. On an ordinary afternoon in the prison camp, Yuki, a Japanese prisoner, was working in the fields with other women. At lunchtime, the American guard supervising them casually opened his metal lunchbox and shared his ham and cheese sandwiches wrapped in wax paper as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Smiling, he explained through the translator, "My wife makes extra." That simple act, sharing a meal with former enemies, stunned Yuki. In that moment, she began to see that kindness could be stronger than any weapon, and the walls built by propaganda started to crumble. The American guard simply said his wife knew the girls were hungry. That woman, who had never met them, didn't know their names, and knew only that they were once enemies, had packed extra sandwiches because she thought strangers might be hungry. Yuki took the sandwich with both hands, bowed deeply, tears streaming down her face. That night she wrote in her journal, "The guard's wife sent sandwiches. She doesn't know us." One quiet act of kindness, yet it tore down the wall between enemy and human. An American guard's wife had packed sandwiches for the Japanese women, the very enemies her country had fought. We were her enemies. Her nation fought ours, and people died for it. Yet she sent sandwiches. Yuki broke into tears. How could she hate people like that? How could she stay loyal to an empire that let her starve while the enemy fed her? The physical change was undeniable. Their faces glowed with color, their eyes regained light, and their bodies looked healthier than they had in years, proof that compassion can heal what war destroys. In the quiet morning light of the washroom, Tomoko stared at her reflection, glowing skin, shining hair, a face full and alive again. She whispered softly, "I look like I did before the war. I look healthy, I look fed." In that moment, she realized her body had been restored, nourished by the very people she once feared. The mirror didn't just reflect her face, it reflected her transformation, proof that kindness could heal not only flesh but the shattered faith within her. Tomoko touched her cheek, feeling the softness where sharp bones once showed. But when the faces of her starving children from the last photograph flashed in her mind, she turned away from the mirror, unable to face herself. The guilt was crushing, pressing down with the weight of everything she could not change. While her body healed in American captivity, her children in Japan were still starving. To be well fed, while your family starved to sleep in a warm bed, while your parents lived in rubble to taste chocolate, while your children foraged for grass, it was a torture more refined than any beating. It was the agony of being shown mercy, when you believed you deserved punishment, of being treated with dignity, when you expected cruelty, of realizing that everything you had been taught about honor, sacrifice, and enemies was a lie. And it was the small, quiet moments that undid them completely. Small, senseless acts of kindness began to erode the walls of hatred and fear they had built for years. One afternoon, Ko carried a stack of neatly folded linens to the hospital when she tripped, sending white sheets scattering across the hallway. Kneeling in shame, she expected anger, but instead heard soft laughter and saw an American doctor kneel beside her to help, smiling kindly as he handed the stack back. In that quiet moment, Ko understood that sometimes the gentlest kindness can destroy the strongest walls of. When the white linens scattered across the hallway, the Japanese woman dropped to her knees, her face burning with shame. Back home, such clumsiness would have earned her harsh punishment. But here, instead of anger, she heard soft laughter, not mocking but kind and human. A young American doctor, Captain Miller, knelt beside her, smiling as he helped gather the sheets. When they finished, he gave her a playful salute and walked away, still smiling. In that small, quiet moment, she realized something profound. Not all enemies seek to humiliate, some simply choose to be human. Ko knelt to gather the scattered linens, her heart pounding with shame. In Japan, such clumsiness would bring scolding or punishment. But here, something unimaginable happened. An American officer knelt beside her, smiling as he helped pick up the sheets. No anger, no contempt, only kindness. When he walked away whistling a tune she didn't recognize, Ko stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the linen in silence, trying to understand. An officer, her enemy, had knelt down to help her. And in that quiet moment, something inside her broke open. Everything she thought she knew about pride, about enemies, about humanity, began to change. One afternoon, Yuki was walking back from the fields when she heard music drifting through an open window. Curious, she stopped and followed the sound. Inside, a group of young American soldiers laughed and chatted around a phonograph as a lively jazz record played. One of them noticed her standing outside, smiled and waved her closer. "You like music?" he asked, through gestures, since neither spoke the other's language. Yuki nodded shyly, caught between fear and fascination. In that fleeting moment, a smile, a melody, two former enemies shared something human, a fragile bridge built from sound and kindness. The American soldier disappeared inside, then returned holding a small record, Glenn Miller and his orchestra. He smiled and said in clumsy Japanese puracento. The young Japanese prisoner froze, staring at the gift in disbelief. In a world shattered by war, this simple act, the giving of music, nothing more, carried the power to dissolve hatred. To her, it wasn't just a gift. It was the first moment the enemy saw her as human. That night, inside the small barracks, Yuki played the record gifted by the American soldier. The music filled the room, bright, brassy, unmistakably American, a sound once associated only with the enemy. Some women frowned and turned away, unable to enjoy it, but others stayed still, letting the melody reach their hearts. In that moment, the invisible wall between victor and vanquished began to fade. Inside the camp during a California winter frost glimmered on the window panes as the Japanese women prisoners awoke, their breath turning to mist in the freezing air. They huddled beneath their blankets, dreading the chill they thought would pierce their bones. But the enemy did the unthinkable. They refused to let them freeze. The Americans brought blankets, coal, and a quiet message: stay warm. In that moment, the women understood that the most powerful weapon wasn't cruelty or fire, it was compassion. That morning, as the chill settled over the camp, the American commander stepped in and spoke through the translator. "We've ordered more blankets and warm coats for all prisoners. They'll arrive next week. Meanwhile, we've increased the coal for your stoves. Stay warm." No ceremony, no expectation of thanks, just a quiet act of care from those once called enemies. At that moment, Tomoko sat at breakfast with tears streaming down her face, realizing that compassion could be more powerful than any weapon or ideology. In the chill of a California morning, Tomoko whispered to the women beside her, "They notice when we're cold, the enemy notices when we're cold, and brings us blankets." The barracks fell silent. In her mind, memories of Hiroshima's winter 2 years earlier returned, her family burning furniture to survive. After the military had taken all the coal, her children's blue lips trembling in the dark. Now it was the enemy who brought warmth. And in that moment, everything she once believed began to crumble, replaced by a devastating truth: compassion can exist even in the heart of an enemy. Their own government had treated its people as expendable resources, yet the enemy, the Americans, brought blankets simply because the prisoners might be cold. In those small human gestures, a doctor helping pick up spilled linens, a soldier giving away his music, a commander ordering blankets, their entire worldview began to crumble. They realized a devastating truth: compassion could be more powerful than any weapon, and kindness itself could dismantle the walls that cruelty never could. How can you hate someone who treats you like a human being? How can loyalty survive when the enemy shows more care than your own leaders ever did? These questions haunted them with no answers that could bring peace. By December, the war within each woman had become more brutal than any external battle they had ever faced, a silent struggle between old faith and the unsettling truth unfolding before them. Ko lay awake most nights, staring at the dark ceiling of the barracks, her thoughts circling endlessly without rest. During the day, she worked in the camp hospital, assisting American nurses with simple tasks. Over time, she learned enough English to follow basic commands and even hold short conversations. Every new word, every exchanged smile, became a small bridge between enemies, proof that humanity could survive even after war had torn everything else apart. Nurse Helen began teaching Ko medical terms, patiently repeating each word until Ko could pronounce it correctly. One afternoon, she placed a gentle hand on Ko's shoulder and said, "You're a natural. You should be a nurse after the war." The words struck deep. After the war, as if there could still be an afterward, as if life could exist beyond the barbed wire. That night, Ko unfolded her mother's letters and read them by flashlight beneath her blanket. Surrounded by comfort she had never known, she felt torn between gratitude and guilt, unsure whether she still deserved the love written in those fragile lines from a ruined home. The words in her mother's letter never changed, but they cut deeper with every reading. Hunger, cold, despair, her little brother growing weaker, her father coughing blood from giving his food away. And here she was, gaining weight, learning English, praised by an American nurse as a natural. Between two worlds, one of starvation, one of mercy, she felt torn between guilt and gratitude, caught in the painful space where kindness itself became a burden. The guilt sat heavy in her chest like a stone, making each breath hard to take. Every bite of food felt like a betrayal, every warm night in her bed like a crime. She was living better than she ever had in Japan, better even than most civilians had lived before the war. And the bitter truth was that she was doing so in the captivity of her enemies. Yuki, once a devoted patriot, now faces a painful reckoning. She had believed in the emperor, in the cause of Greater East Asia, volunteering for military service, and embracing every word of propaganda, ready to die for Japan. But after the war, those beliefs began to crumble. Caught between survival and betrayal, Yuki asks herself, am I a survivor, a traitor, or both? Yuki's beliefs were breaking apart piece by piece. She had been told that Americans were racist, that they would treat Japanese people as inferior. Yet every day she saw American soldiers showing her casual respect, something she had never known before. She had believed that American culture was shallow and corrupt, but now, in their quiet kindness, Yuki found something she couldn't define, genuine humanity that made every lie she'd been taught collapse into dust. Yuki had once believed that surrender was a dishonor worse than death. Yet here she was alive, clean, healthy, and the shame she felt came not from surrender, but from how comfortable she had become. In the quiet barracks, she opened her journal to write her thoughts, yet no words came, because sometimes truth itself leaves us speechless. In the stillness of the camp, Yuki stared at her journal, where she wrote the words that made her tremble. I have become the enemy. Not because she was held by Americans, but because she had begun to see them as human. In that moment, every belief she had been taught unraveled. She realized that kindness, not cruelty, was the force that could make a heart surrender. Yuki sat silently before the page, writing a question that no one could answer. If everything I was taught was a lie, then what was I loyal to? What did I sacrifice for? Emptiness spread through the camp. Every woman fought her own private battle. Some clung to hatred to preserve their old beliefs. Others ate in bitter silence, accepting comfort, but rejecting any human connection. In that quiet, they began to realize that sometimes truth isn't found in victory or defeat, but in the courage to face what you fear the most. Inside the California camp, some Japanese women closed themselves off, their faces hard, their eyes cold, accepting survival, but nothing more. Yet others moved in the opposite direction, embracing their new reality with fragile enthusiasm. They learned English, eagerly laughed with the American soldiers, and listened to jazz without guilt. In those small, awkward smiles, a part of their humanity began to return, not through surrender, but through the quiet discovery that kindness could be stronger than war. Between the extremes, those who rejected everything American and those who shed their Japanese identity for the comfort of acceptance, most of the women existed somewhere in between. Torn between two worlds, they could no longer return to what they had been, yet could not fully embrace what they were becoming. Inside that camp, the real battle was no longer between nations, but within each heart, a struggle between memory, identity, and the awakening of compassion from the enemy. The Japanese women prisoners were trapped in a psychological no-man's land, too changed to return to who they had been, yet too Japanese to embrace who they were becoming. To the Americans, they appeared well-adjusted, healthy, and even friendly. They didn't see the midnight tears, the guilt-stained journals, or the whispered conversations about loyalty and betrayal. In the silent nights of the POW camp, the debates began as whispers, quiet, cautious, then grew louder, more heated, more desperate. No one knew how to help those whose entire worldview was collapsing. How do you comfort someone suffering not from cruelty but from kindness? The enemy's mercy had forced them to confront a new kind of war, the one inside their minds where every belief they once held began to crumble. The captured Japanese women struggled to make sense of what was happening to them, and the only way was to talk, to argue, to wrestle with the truth together. Among them, Fumiko, a former translator from the Philippines, held firmly to her old beliefs. We are still Japanese. She refused to learn English, never smiled at the Americans, and ate her meals with her back turned to the guards. Yet in those tense conversations, the first cracks began to form in the walls of everything they once believed. Fumiko insisted that American kindness was mere political theater they fed them, because the Geneva Convention required it, not because they cared. To her, dignity in captivity was what would matter when they returned home. But Yuki struck back. What dignity remained when the men who promised glory and victory had delivered only hunger and defeat? Their clash exposed the widening gulf between old loyalty and new truth, between illusion and humanity. Inside the dim barracks, tension cracked the silence. Yuki rose to her feet, voice trembling but firm. The enemy feeds us, clothes us, treats us like human beings, and we're supposed to feel ashamed of that. I'm done being ashamed. Fumiko snapped back. "You're being brainwashed. That's exactly what they want, to make us forget who we are, to make us grateful, to make us complicit." Ko lifted her head quietly and asked, "Complicit in what?" The question hung in the air, fragile, dangerous, marking the moment when hatred began to crumble and truth began to take its place. She sat on her bed, knees pulled tight to her chest. The war was over. Japan had lost. What sin could there be in accepting food and shelter? Fumiko's voice cut through the silence. They were complicit in their own humiliation, part of the narrative that America was the merciful victor, and they the grateful defeated. Beneath her words lay a painful truth, that perhaps the enemy had shown more humanity than their own nation ever had. Sachiko, a 19-year-old clerk from a medical unit, quietly voiced what others feared to admit. She had been taught that Americans had no honor and no respect for human life. Yet, in the prison camp, she witnessed the opposite: respect, decency, and compassion, unlike anything she had seen within the Imperial Army. Her simple words shattered the old certainties, revealing the painful truth that humanity sometimes lives in the hearts of those we once called enemies. Tomoko had once watched Japanese officers beat soldiers for minor mistakes. Commanders send men to certain death and call it glory. Yet here in captivity she saw American soldiers joke with each other, treat their officers as human beings, follow orders without worshipping them. That was not weakness, that was democracy, a strength born from respect rather than fear. In the barracks, the oldest woman, nearly 40, spoke with a calm authority that silenced the room. She had once read banned books describing a radical idea that people could question power, that leaders were meant to serve their citizens, not rule them. In that moment, the Japanese prisoners began to realize that another kind of world existed, one where human worth came not from obedience, but from the courage to question and the freedom to think. Tomoko watched the Americans decorating the Christmas tree, and for a fleeting moment believed democracy might be real, not just a slogan. But Fumiko answered coldly, "Democracy didn't stop them from dropping atomic bombs on our cities. Democracy didn't stop them from firebombing Tokyo, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Don't romanticize them just because they're kind to us now." The barracks fell silent. Between the two women stood the clash of worlds, the fragile hope of a new belief, and the unhealed memory of war's devastation. Silence fell across the barracks because Fumiko was right and everyone knew it. The same nation that had given them chocolate and blankets had also unleashed destruction on a scale beyond comprehension. How could both be true? How could Americans be capable of both compassion and cruelty? Yuki spoke softly. Maybe that's what makes them powerful. They can do both. Her words captured the paradox of power, that true strength lies not only in the ability to destroy, but in the choice to show mercy after the storm of war. They could destroy their enemies completely and then treat them with mercy afterward. That wasn't weakness. It was strength. Terrifying strength. The conversations continued, night after night, without resolution. Generational divides emerged. The older women who remembered Japan before militarism began to question what they had been taught, while the younger ones, raised on wartime propaganda, struggled to reconcile their beliefs with the humanity they were witnessing. The younger women who had grown up with wartime propaganda struggled to let go of their beliefs. Some withdrew into silence, unwilling to face questions that had no clear answers. Others became consumed by debate, arguing for hours as if the right words could make sense of the senseless. A silent battle between belief and truth, fought not on the battlefield but within their own minds. Beneath all the arguments and inner struggles lay a devastating truth every woman felt, but few could express. They had been deceived about the enemy, about the war, about what loyalty and honor truly meant. Those lies had cost them everything: their homes, their families, their very sense of identity. As the propaganda veil fell away, they faced not only the collapse of their nation, but the shattering of faith in everything they once held sacred. After the chaos of war, they faced not just the ruins of cities, but the ruins of their own beliefs. Everything that once seemed certain had shattered. Yet, to move forward, they had to confront the truth, painful, exhausting, but necessary. They could never return to who they had been before. They were trapped in transformation, and the only way out was through with courage, persistence, and the strength to face what they once denied. That December, the camp organized a Christmas celebration, the moment when everything changed. The Japanese women, once trembling before their enemy, now watched in awe as Americans decorated a glowing Christmas tree with lights, stars, and small gifts. For the first time, they saw their captors singing, laughing, and inviting them to join, not with weapons, but with kindness. In that instant, they understood that America's true power didn't come from bombs or guns, but from compassion strong enough to disarm the human heart. That Christmas night, the prison camp came alive with music, food, and gifts, things no one believed could ever be offered to prisoners of war. Most of the Japanese women attended out of curiosity, sitting in neat rows as American soldiers sang and performed skits. Some jokes were lost in translation, but the laughter bridged something far deeper. In that simple evening of song and surprise, fear began to fade, replaced by the first fragile spark of shared humanity. The Americans were trying. They put on a small performance to bring joy to their Japanese women prisoners. Then came an unexpected gift. Each woman received a neatly wrapped package. Ko opened hers with trembling hands to find a bar of soap, a comb, a small mirror, and a chocolate bar inside. Simple, practical things, yet profoundly moving. Those humble items symbolized compassion from those once called enemies. That quiet act of kindness melted the fear and distrust that war had built, proving humanity could exist even behind barbed wire. At the Christmas celebration in the POW camp, Ko unwrapped a small gift wrapped in bright paper and ribbon, as if it were precious. Inside were only a bar of soap, a comb, a tiny mirror, and a chocolate bar. Simple things, yet they made her cry. They weren't meant to buy loyalty or gratitude. They were simply human gestures. In that quiet moment, she realized that kindness, when given freely and without agenda, could break down walls more powerfully than any weapon, cracking her heart open like a seed ready for new growth. One human gave another a small, simple gift just because it was Christmas. In that instant, Ko understood. The Americans weren't kind out of politics or duty under the Geneva Convention. They did it simply because that's how they treated people, even enemies, even prisoners, even the Japanese women they had fought weeks earlier. And that Ko realized was the most dangerous truth of all, that compassion can dismantle propaganda by revealing shared humanity. American power came not only from bombs and bullets, but from a far deeper idea that every person has value, that even one's enemy deserves basic dignity, and that victory does not require cruelty. This was the ideology Japan had fought against, the belief that individuals mattered more than the collective, that human rights existed beyond nationality or loyalty. And astonishingly, that idea was already transforming those who once saw it as their enemy. Every meal, every blanket, every small kindness stood as proof of a profound philosophy. You can destroy us with your armies, but you rebuild us with your mercy. These gestures needed no words, they quietly declared. We can crush you with power, but we'll heal you with compassion. Beside, Koyuki sat holding her small wrapped gift, tears streaming down her face. She whispered, "It's not a weapon, it's just who they are." Amid the soft glow of the Christmas hall, the women's tears were no longer of sorrow, but of release tears for the beliefs they had lost and the truths they had finally seen. Tomoko Rose walked to the front and bowed deeply to the American commander, not in surrender, but in gratitude. In that instant, all the walls of hate fell away. The enemy had shown them something no victory ever could, that kindness, not cruelty, is the most devastating force of all, the one that awakens the human soul. The room fell silent as Ko, speaking through the translator, said, "Thank you for treating us like human beings. We didn't expect this. We were taught to expect cruelty, but you have shown us something different, something we don't fully understand yet, but we are grateful." Her heartfelt words made the commander slightly uncomfortable, shifting his weight and his face turning slightly red. The American soldier said they were just following the rules, yet their actions, protecting prisoners, respecting their dignity, choosing mercy over vengeance, made a profound difference. As the party continued, the female prisoners began to sense a deep shift within the barracks, realizing that humanity had the power to break their old beliefs. The hardline women became fewer and the debates grew quieter. A collective exhaustion settled over them, the exhaustion of resisting relentless humanity. They could no longer maintain their hatred in the face of these devoted people. They couldn't cling to propaganda labeling Americans as demons when those very demons were giving them Christmas presents. The women could not remain loyal to an empire that had abandoned them when the enemy was the only thing keeping them alive. The transformation was not complete. It would take years for them to fully process it. Yet in that moment, in a decorated hall with a Christmas tree and wrapped gifts, they began to see their captors not as enemies, but as people, flawed, imperfect, yet human. The Americans, capable of terrible deeds, were still human. In seeing this, the Japanese women POWs began to question everything they had been taught. The most dangerous weapon America possessed was not the atomic bomb, but the radical idea that human dignity transcended national boundaries. While organizing medical supplies in the hospital storage room, Ko suddenly saw her reflection in a glass cabinet door. She stopped moving and stared, unable to recognize herself at first. This mirror moment reflected the profound physical and emotional transformation she had undergone due to the kindness and care of the Americans, a turning point in her journey of self-awareness and recognition of her own worth. Ko looked into the mirror and saw her reflection: round cheeks, clear skin, bright eyes, healthy hair shining even in the dim light. She looked young again, alive. The hollow, haunted look from 2 years of war was completely gone. She looked not just like before the war, but healthier and more vibrant than ever. Even in peacetime, Japan Ko had never eaten this well, never had access to proper medical care, and never been this healthy. The enemy had restored her to herself. Her hands began to shake. She braced against the cabinet, breathing in short gasps. In that moment, seeing her own healthy reflection, Ko felt the full weight of betrayal crash over her. Not by the Americans, but by her own country. Japan had taken her youth, her health, and her innocence, using people as fuel for the war machine. They fed her propaganda instead of food ideology, instead of medicine, demanding sacrifice while offering nothing in return. Japan had told Ko that suffering was noble, that hunger was honorable, and that dying for the emperor was the highest calling. All lies. In reality, she stood in the prisoner of war camp healthier and happier than she had ever been as a free citizen of the empire. Ko stood there, fed, clothed, and treated with dignity by the very people she had been taught to fear and hate. The Americans hadn't broken her with cruelty. They had broken her with the truth that she was worth feeding, worth caring for, worth treating like a human being, and that truth demolished everything she thought she knew about loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. Ko slid down to the floor, her back against the cabinet, sobbing deeply. Not quiet tears, but wrenching sobs coming from a primal and wounded place. She cried for the girl who had believed propaganda for the years wasted, serving a cause that had never valued her, and for her family still suffering in Japan. Ko cried for all those who had died, believing their sacrifices mattered, realizing they had only been fuel for those who didn't care. 10 minutes later, Nurse Helen arrived, saw Ko's pain, and understood it without words, a moment showing profound humanity, transcending enemy lines and the horrors of war. Helen sat down on the floor beside Ko, not touching her, not trying to fix it, just sitting with her in grief. "It's okay," Helen said softly. "It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel betrayed. You were lied to. You have every right to grieve." Ko looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. This simple yet profound moment opened the door to healing and renewed trust within Ko. The American woman who had every reason to hate Ko sat on the hospital floor, offering comfort as Ko broke down. In that moment, Ko's worldview didn't just crack, it shattered completely. She realized that sometimes an enemy's kindness is more powerful than any weapon. This is what democracy looks like. Every individual has inherent worth, regardless of which side of a war they are on. This is the philosophy that Japan had been fighting against, which treated people as mere tools of the state rather than individuals deserving respect. Human rights were not granted by emperors or earned through sacrifice. They simply existed because humans existed. Ko recognized the undeniable difference between a system that treated people as tools and one that respected human dignity. And thinking of her little brother starving in Tokyo, she saw the complete failure of Japan's ideology. Ko reflected on the American soldier yesterday who had shared his lunch with her. She thought of the emperor in his palace untouched by the suffering of his people, and of the American commander ordering extra blankets for cold prisoners. The comparison was devastating and undeniable. That evening, Ko stood in the barracks and spoke to the assembled women. This was the moment she realized the difference between ideology and humane reality. Ko spoke in a quiet but steady voice. She looked at herself in the mirror today and realized she was healthier now than she had ever been as a free citizen of Japan. She understood this was not because America was perfect, but because Japan had completely and utterly failed its people. Ko looked around the room at faces both sympathetic and resistant. She wasn't saying they should forget who they were or become American, but she emphasized the need to acknowledge the truth. They had been lied to about the war, about the enemy, and about what their country was fighting for. Only by recognizing the truth could they move forward. Silence filled the barracks. Slowly, one by one, the women began to nod. Some cried, some looked away, but most nodded. They had all seen themselves in mirrors and felt the cognitive dissonance of being healthier in captivity than in freedom. Each of them wrestled with this devastating realization. The enemy treated them like human beings, revealing that their own country never had. All resistance, denial, and desperate clinging to old beliefs washed away suddenly like a dam breaking, leaving behind a painful yet liberating truth. The Japanese women were still Japanese and would always remain so, yet their experiences in the camp had transformed them completely. They no longer blindly believed in propaganda or thought suffering for the state was noble. As winter turned to spring, rumors of repatriation began to circulate throughout the camp. Ships were being prepared and arrangements were underway. The women were soon to be sent back to Japan. The news should have brought joy. They were going home, back to their families, their homeland, and their culture. This was what they had been waiting for, wasn't it? But instead of joy, the women felt dread. Ko lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her stomach twisted in knots. Her mother's letters painted a picture of Tokyo in ruins, food scarce, disease rampant. The Japan she remembered, full of cherry blossoms, festivals, and order, was gone, replaced by chaos, hunger, and despair. Yuki would return to Japan healthy, well-fed, with color in her cheeks and flesh on her bones. But how could she explain that to her starving family? How could she look her little brother in his hollow eyes and tell him she had been eating roast chicken while he foraged for weeds? One evening, Yuki confessed to her roommate, "I'm afraid to go back." The Japanese female POWs faced intense internal conflict. Japan was their home, their families were there, yet the American camp treated them more kindly than their own country ever had. They could not voice this without feeling like traitors, yet deep inside the truth remained, as Sachiko quietly admitted. Yuki tried not to think about it, but she knew it was true. She didn't want to return to a country where women were seen merely as tools for men. She didn't want to go back to a place where her worth was measured solely by her service to the state and rigid duties. The Japanese women POWs whispered among themselves, tinged with shame, realizing they had come to prefer life in American captivity over freedom in Japan. They did not love America, nor had they abandoned their identity, but basic human needs, food, shelter, dignity, mattered more than abstract notions of loyalty and patriotism. Some Japanese women POWs began asking the American officers if they could remain in America rather than be repatriated. The answer was always no, due to the Geneva Convention's requirements. Yet the act of asking itself revealed profound change. Women who had been taught that death was preferable to dishonor were now pleading to stay with former enemies, showing their character and perception had transformed. Propaganda had said that Americans would break the women, yet the breaking did not come through cruelty. Instead, it came through the power of humanity. Acts of kindness, care, and the simple demonstration that there was a better way to live. When the ships departed in April 1946, the female prisoners carried with them a profound realization about human value, the enemy, and themselves. The Japanese women POWs stood on deck watching San Francisco Bay disappear behind them. The Golden Gate Bridge shrank on the horizon. Many cried, some waved goodbye to the American guards on the pier who had come to see them off. The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks with conditions less comfortable than the camp. The repatriation journey of the Japanese women POWs was difficult. The seas were rough and the ships crowded, yet they were fed regularly and treated with basic dignity, unlike the nightmare voyages of the war years. When the Japanese coast finally appeared on the horizon, the women saw complete devastation, cities reduced to rubble, and their hearts sank in despair. Cities were reduced to ash harbors, filled with half-sunken ships and coastlines scarred by bombing. As they sailed past Hiroshima, the extent of the atomic bomb's damage became visible. An entire city was simply gone, flattened, erased. When they docked at Yokohama, the full force of the devastating reality hit them. Japan after the war appeared with skeletal buildings, streets lined with rubble, and ragged citizens struggling to survive each day. Children were malnourished, women selling anything they owned just to make ends meet. When Ko stepped off the ship, she felt no joy, only crushing sadness. The stark contrast between the care she received in America and the devastation at home was an unimaginable emotional shock. Ko and the other women wept at the devastation of Japan, processed through the repatriation center with minimal supplies, and had to find their way home. She boarded a train to Tokyo, witnessing burned forests, collapsed bridges, and ghost towns, before finally locating her family in a makeshift shelter in what had once been a prosperous neighborhood. Ko returned home after 2 years as a prisoner of war. She saw that her mother had aged 20 years, her father was sick with tuberculosis, and her 12-year-old little brother was so thin she could hardly recognize him. At first, her family's faces lit with joy upon seeing her, but the joy quickly shifted to confusion and then to something resembling accusation, as if they silently questioned her for being well-fed and safe while they continued to suffer. Ko returned to Japan healthy with color in her cheeks and nourishment in her body. Looking at her mother, she realized a painful truth: she had been eating well and living safely, while her family suffered starvation and hardship. Her mother's words were gentle yet loaded. "The Americans treated you well." Ko understood that nothing more needed to be said. She had been with the enemy while they had lost everything. The guilt they had felt in the camp was nothing compared to what they felt now. Over the years, Japan slowly rebuilt itself from ruins into an economic powerhouse. The occupation ended, and democracy took root, awkward at first, but becoming stronger. The women who had been prisoners in America scattered across the country, rebuilding their lives, rarely speaking of their experiences. Ko was fundamentally and irrevocably changed by her time in the American camp. She became a nurse, choosing never to marry, and dedicating her life to healing. In the 1960s, she opened a small clinic in Tokyo, applying the philosophy she had learned in captivity, treating patients with compassion, dignity, and respect for every human life. Ko realized that every person, regardless of status or background, deserved dignity and care. She kept her American nursing textbooks a parting gift from Nurse Helen as a reminder of the human lessons she had learned. Meanwhile, Yuki married an American soldier during the occupation and moved to California, illustrating personal transformation beyond borders and prejudice. Ko's actions caused a scandal in her family, but she didn't care. She had seen enough to know that love and kindness mattered more than national pride. She raised 3 children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with chopsticks and forks, learning that identity didn't have to be singular or pure. Tomoko returned to her children and spent the rest of her life teaching them what she had learned: that propaganda is dangerous, questioning authority is not only acceptable but necessary, and that a person's worth does not come from service to the state but from their inherent humanity. Most of the other women never spoke publicly about their time as prisoners, yet the lessons they imparted quietly endured across generations. The former Japanese women prisoners experienced deep shame and painful contradictions. Yet in private conversations with their daughters and granddaughters, they passed on invaluable lessons, teaching the next generation to question, think critically, recognize propaganda, and understand that the enemy is not always who they were told to hate. Sometimes the people who treat you with the most humanity are the ones you least expect. Soap, chocolate, and clean sheets became more than mere objects. They symbolized a power mightier than any weapon. They demonstrated the belief that every human life held value, even those of enemies or those who had fought against you. These small gestures challenged rigid notions of enemy and strength, showing that compassion can be the most devastating power of all. For those Japanese women prisoners, the taste of chocolate and the smell of soap became proof that everything they had been taught was a lie. The enemy could show mercy. Human dignity was more powerful than cruelty. Sometimes the hardest thing to carry isn't hatred but kindness from those they expected to hate them. In her final years, Ko told her niece about her time in the American camp. The young woman, born decades after the war, listened with wide eyes. "So the Americans were good to you?" she asked. Ko shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. They dropped atomic bombs on our cities. They killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They were capable of terrible things." She paused, looking out at modern Tokyo, all glass and steel and prosperity. Yet it was the mercy and dignity shown by her enemy that changed her more than any punishment could. It made her question everything she had believed. Throughout her life, she worked to pass on the lesson that your enemy might treat you better than your own people. Propaganda is always a lie, no matter who speaks it. Human dignity transcends borders and nationalism. These lessons cost Ko everything she once believed, but they gave her the ability to see clearly. That is the story worth remembering. These women discovered that the real battlefield was not between nations but between ideologies. The lesson comes from those who were once taught to see enemies as tools, yet demonstrated that human dignity transcends boundaries, even for enemies. Stories like this remind us of the inherent value of every person, and that history is full of uncomfortable truths. Subscribe to the channel to catch more essential lessons about humanity. These stories challenge what we think we know about enemies, allies, war, and peace, making us question who the real monsters are. They matter because they remind us that humanity can exist even in the darkest times, and sometimes the most dangerous weapon is simple kindness. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, encouraging reflection and lessons from the past.